Okay, thank you. On that note, then I'd like to welcome our next two witnesses, Professor Monica Gattinger. She is the Chair of Positive Energy from the University of Ottawa, and Dr. Alika Lafontaine from the Alberta Health Services, who's joining us by way of video conference. So thank you both for being here today. We're going to open the floor to both of you to provide a presentation up to 10 minutes each, and then we're going to turn it over to the committee members for questions. So it's up to you who wants to go first. Professor Gattinger, you're smiling. I'm gonna pick on you, so you can start us off.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And la présentation a été traduite.
The presentation was translated, so you can consult it here.
To come and speak with you today. Comme vous venez d'apprendre,
As you just learned, I speak both official languages, so if you have questions in French, please feel free to ask them.
About the role of public confidence and unlocking Canada's energy potential. At the University of Ottawa, we've been doing some research in this space for the last little while, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of the results of that research and speaking to this issue. Very briefly, to begin with, I'm just going to very briefly lay out the context. I often think of energy and the challenges and changes in the energy sector as very much a brave new world of energy development, and I'll speak about that in a moment. I'll talk with you very briefly about the Positive Energy Project and then dive into public confidence and the important role of public confidence when it comes to energy development and unlocking Canada's energy potential. So it is very much a brave new world of energy development. I've been studying energy policy and regulation for I guess 20 odd years or so now, and there has never been a time at which it's been so controversial and so frequently in the headlines, in my experience, up until this point. And I often think of the policy and regulatory context, which has become increasingly complex as governments, in essence, in search of what I think of as a holy grail of energy policy and regulation. So trying to identify the appropriate balance points between a number of key policy imperatives, many of which this committee is studying at the moment. So market imperatives, looking at economic opportunities, environmental imperatives, notably climate change, but obviously other areas of environmental impact of energy, security imperatives, so security of critical energy infrastructure and the like. And then the fourth imperative, and this is the one that I'm going to be focusing my remarks on, is how does one go about garnering social acceptance and support when it comes to finding the appropriate balance points between those three previous imperatives: market, environment, and security. So I'm going to dive into that in a moment. As I mentioned, the politics of energy are really becoming increasingly fierce and very polarized. And so we've seen a shift in energy politics over the last number of years from much more localized concerns around energy, neatly captured by the acronym NIMBY, so not in my backyard, to what I refer to as much more principled opposition to energy development, particularly fossil fuel energy development. So an opposition to the development of those energy resources in toto. Again, captured tongue-in-cheek by this acronym BANANA, which folks have probably heard of: build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. A much different form of opposition, a much different kind of politics that policymakers, regulators, and industry are facing. And clearly, as we've seen over the last number of years, this slows down project decisions. It can slow down and even halt altogether project construction. Then the question becomes, can we afford to go on this way? It's costly in terms of money and time going into projects, both on the proponent side, but on the opponent's side as well. Many deteriorating relationships, and I'll speak about those in a moment, and of considerable interest to this community, lost economic opportunities and the potential risk of capital flight as well. So in the context of this, the Positive Energy Project, which I chair, really does two key things. The first is to use the convening power of the university to bring key energy players together to grapple with this issue of how does one strengthen public confidence in energy development. And we're not referring exclusively here to fossil fuels. As we know, it's not just fossil fuel projects that run into social opposition. It can be hydro, it can be wind farms, and the like. But we do more than convening. We do what I think of as convening plus. So we also undertake solution-oriented applied research to try to inform dialogue and action. So I'll be sharing with you some of the results of that research today. So what drives public confidence? What impacts or influence the level of confidence that individual citizens and communities have in energy development? Well, there are really three key factors that affect public confidence. And if we go sort of clockwise around this circle, starting in the top left, clearly governments, policy and regulation that governments put in place has an impact on the levels of public confidence in energy. Moving on towards the next bubble there, society. So NGO activities, local communities' views, individual neighbors' views, these also have an impact on attitudes, opinions, and levels of public confidence in energy. And of course also industry. And industry performance has an impact on public confidence. So why then do we see the level of controversy around energy and what many are thinking of as a declining public confidence in energy development? Why now? What has changed in the context over the last number of years that creates this? So this diagram here seeks to capture that. There are a variety of different factors. There's no single factor that drives public confidence. I'm not going to speak to all of these factors. I'll be speaking to the first two noted on this diagram. So social and value change over the last number of decades. A number of areas of public policy where we see gaps in policy movement on a number of key areas that are leading to declines in public confidence. Regulatory responses notably to those policy gaps, and then also project proponent practices. But as I said, I'm just going to focus in on the social and value change and the policy gaps. I'd be happy to get into the other topics in the discussion session if that's of interest. So social and value change. I think it's not to be underestimated that we are not in the same world of energy development as we were in the 1950s. Right, the last time we had the level of controversy over pipeline development in this country, you would have to go back to the 1950s, right? But it's a very different context now than it was almost 60, 70 years ago now. So we see a number of key changes in society that are actually driving or making it much more challenging to develop public confidence in energy. And so I've listed a few of these here. I won't speak to any of them in great levels of detail, but they're things that I think we can all quite readily experience in our own daily lives. So decline of trust, public trust in institutions, that's public institutions, that's private institutions, and that's writ large, right? We're not just focusing here on energy. And also a decline in deference to authority and expertise. We're not in a sort of rational, comprehensive, technocratic, expert-driven approach to policymaking or to governance as we might have been in the 1950s. Second, a desire for greater public involvement in decision-making. People want to be involved in decisions that are going to be affecting them. A shift from communitarian to individual values, right? So the line of sight of interests is often much more at the local level and local impacts and individual impacts than it is at the national level. And I often sort of think of this when you hear that rephrase, who speaks for Canada? Right? Where is the national interest in some of these discussions? And what we're trying to point out here with our research is that some of these social and value changes make it much more difficult to appeal to those kinds of values. Fourth, a rise of what we can think of as maybe sort of anti-corporate or anti-big business or even anti-fossil fuel values. So much more of a preference when it comes to project developments for smaller scale, locally owned kinds of developments. And then a decline in risk tolerance as well. As Beck pointed out, we live in a risk society, but we also live in one in which the trust that folks have in the capacity for governments and industry to mitigate risk and to manage risk if things go wrong has declined as well. So that's social and value change. Policy gaps, very quickly, I don't think I'm saying anything here that folks wouldn't have already given some thought to, but climate change. The extent to which there has been real or perceived lesser movement and lesser availability of forums to address climate change in a meaningful fashion over the last, and I'm not just referring to previous governments, but governments prior to that as well, over the last number of decades. Indigenous issues and reconciliation, that was referred to in the previous testimony of the previous witnesses, the need to address in a meaningful fashion some of the key issues that Indigenous communities are concerned about. And again, this goes beyond energy. Right, so it can be about clean drinking water, it can be about housing, it can be about murdered and missing Indigenous women, a whole host of issues that go far beyond energy on its own. And these policy gaps, sort of concern that there hasn't been as much movement on these issues as there might have been, can also be exacerbated by siloization both within governments, so within, whether it's at the federal level or between governments federally, provincially, and to some extent even municipally as well. And of course, as is noted here, the third policy gap around a lack of mechanisms to address cumulative effects or to plan in a regional fashion when it comes to the cumulative impact of a number of different energy projects. So one of the impacts of these policy gaps, well, one of the things that we see is that they have increasingly been cascading onto the regulatory process and onto individual regulatory processes for individual policy, for individual energy projects. So unresolved policy issues being played out in regulatory processes, so concerns about climate change, about lack of movement on reconciliation, about cumulative, lack of mechanisms for cumulative impacts or regional planning, that then people turn to the forums that exist. The forums that often exist in that context are regulatory processes for individual projects, right? And regulatory processes are not necessarily well suited to address those kinds of concerns, and that then can exacerbate this issue and lead to reduced public confidence as well. So what to do? I think first and foremost, one of the things that our research has suggested is very important to accept that the horse has left the barn on some of these issues. It is not the 1950s anymore. There sometimes in conversations, and we've probably all had these conversations, there's a desire to sort of move back to the golden age when governments could act in a more unilateral fashion, when publics did have greater levels of trust in government, in expert opinion, and the like. We're not in that kind of an environment anymore, so it really does mean rethinking the way in which we do energy, for lack of a better term. Second, address these policy gaps, and this is one area where I must say that I'm cautiously optimistic. Certainly a number of governments here at the federal level, but also provincially, are beginning to move in a more meaningful fashion around issues like climate, like reconciliation, trying to address cumulative and regional impacts of individual energy projects. But addressing the policy gaps is part of the, sort of part of the solution, but it's not the only piece of the solution. It's also important to strengthen confidence in decision making. And that's not just the substance of energy decisions, it's also the process of those decisions. We're doing some work right now in communities that's really pointing to the importance of the process when it comes to energy project decision making, that communities want to have access to those decision-making processes. They want to have access to relevant information related to an individual energy project. And in many instances as well, our research is pointing to the important role of building capacity at the local level, particularly in municipal governments, but in other sectors as well, to actually engage in energy decision-making. And on the substance side of things, one of the themes that's coming through very, very close, I'm saying close because he's saying I've got 2 minutes left.
That's less than that, much less than that.
Okay, well, this is the last slide. One of the things that's coming through in our research in terms of themes is this sense of that there is not enough fairness when it comes to the distribution of benefits and costs of energy development. I think that's something that we'll need to grapple with in a meaningful and evidence-based fashion. And the fourth thing that I would point to here is to beware the literacy trap. And the reason I say that is it's not uncommon, faced with challenges around public confidence, that the response, whether it's of industry or policy and regulatory decision makers, is to say, well, if only the public understood, If only the public understood what we're grappling with here, they would be more supportive and confidence would be heightened. I think there are real limits to that literacy thesis. There's a lot of very interesting research coming out right now that's demonstrating those limits, and I'd be happy to speak to them in the discussion session. And I would just end by saying that there is an opportunity for Canada to move from the bleeding edge to the leading edge of this issue. We have a large resource base, the largest petroleum resource base of any industrialized democracy in the world, right? So we are grappling with these issues on an ongoing basis, and there's an opportunity here for us to move to the leading edge of that challenge. Thank you.